Morning, everyone, or good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to the South Asian Women in Higher Education Network's Researcher Series. This is our second session of the series this year. It's really wonderful to see some familiar faces in the room or some familiar names in the room and some new names who have come today. So fantastic. Great to have you all here in this learning space and, connections we can make moving forward. Just before we get started then, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Dr. Rumi Begum. I'm a senior lecturer in nutrition and exercise science, and I'm based at the University of Westminster in London. In my spare time then, I help with the SAWHE network in terms of events managing and so forth. Today then, I will be co-chairing this session with Dr. Saima Rahman Khan, and really to get the session going in terms of telling you that this researcher series is not just about pursuing knowledge, but also about creating community and building a community that challenges barriers, amplifies voices, and redefines excellence. So today, as we gather scholars, practitioners, maybe emerging researchers, what we want to do is continue this mission in creating an inclusive and equitable academic space. And we hope to do this by spotlighting some of the researchers in our higher education community. So with that, I'm going to pass on to my co-host, Saima.
Thank you, Rumi, for the excellent introduction of the session. And to introduce myself, I'm Saima. I'm the founder of SAWHE and also a research project manager working at the university and also at the NHS. And today I'll be co-chairing the session with the wonderful Rumi. And so I thought we'll get started by first introducing our speaker for the second episode of the series. And our speaker is Dr. Javeria Khadija Shah. And Javeria is an interdisciplinary scholar. She's an educator, a cultural sociologist, and her work focuses on identity formation, belonging, and recognition across higher education spaces around policy and arts. Her research explores how identities are shaped, imposed, and negotiated within institutions, and her particular attention is to race, migration, and naming, and diasporic experience. I need to learn more about diasporic experience. I have no idea what that means, and I'm looking forward to understanding more on it. She is the principal investigator of the My Name Is research project, which is an interdisciplinary initiative examining the racialized politics of naming and identity. And she is also the author of the My Name Is book. Oh, how exciting. And it's ongoing research continuation, extending to the project's impact into education and organizational context. So without further ado, over to you, Javeria. Thank you for joining us today.
No, thank you to both of you, and to also sorry, this space is incredible, and I'm so happy and glad to be here. And thank you for everyone that's come today. I really appreciate you being here. So, without further ado, this Zoom girl's going to see if she still remembers what it is to be a Zoom girl. Do let me know if you can see my slides. I will go into slideshow very shortly. Can you see my slides? Wonderful, lovely. Okay. So firstly, as I said, thank you for the invitation and for creating the space that centers South Asian women in higher education. I want to begin briefly by situating my journey, not just as a personal narrative for its own sake, but because my research emerges directly from lived encounters and institutions. Particularly centered around experiences of power and belonging. So what I share at the start is the groundwork for the questions I now ask as a researcher. So, oops, sorry, I've come too far, bear with. So I think essentially what I'm really interested in is not just who belongs in higher education and on what terms, but who belongs where, who belongs in this society, who belongs in the spaces that are harbored within this society, and on what terms. My my own navigating of that belonging has been really complicated, and I think that's ended up fueling a lot of the research questions that now emerge. Global majority and South Asian women are routinely, simultaneously relied upon for labor, yet marginalized when it comes to power structures. The mechanism is such that, I'm interested in wanting to investigate how institutions manufacture legitimacy and how inclusion labor is then extracted without offering security or progression. So often what's happening is that we're finding that we're being pulled in lots of different directions, particularly in institutional spaces. We're never really able to step fully into our, through the lack of a better word, quote unquote, generic expertise, but rather relied upon always to fill the equality and inclusion gaps. What that often does is it's a huge extraction of labor, but it also simultaneously can function as a barrier to one's own progression and one's own development. This isn't something that's just a phenomenon now. It's something that we've been seeing, certainly in my lifetime, several decades, where not just the HE sector, not just the education sector, but many sectors across the UK have unfortunately been critiqued for a range of structural and systemic barriers on the grounds of gender and race. So what I'm interested in is how identity is then negotiated. How can we remain authentic to ourselves, to our values, to what drives us, to what's important to us, whilst navigating these terrains? How can we resist in a way that still enables us to be part of these spaces, and to be accepted within them? And how much are we willing to perform, and to what cost does that performativity come? So going back to what I was saying in terms of introducing you a little bit to myself. So my original training was in film, particularly in documentary and media. And I studied up to postgraduate, up to master's level in this field, while simultaneously being involved in a range of skill-based media work alongside my studies. So I worked across filmmaking, television, video editing, and print media, including expatriate magazines and freelance creative work. But media is not an education-led sector, unfortunately. It's governed by informal networks, so it's about who you know. It's governed by a very difficult to penetrate gatekeeping, unspoken hierarchies, where experience matters more than qualifications and who you know matters more than what you can do. So despite the experience that I kept accumulating and despite the qualifications, I found that access to fair experience that represented where I was at in my career was unequal, and the barriers made it extremely difficult, but also that it was a very gendered and very racialized landscape. So we're talking the 90s, so being a global majority woman, it was an extremely difficult landscape to be sort of navigating at that time. So I encountered early on how talent and labor can be welcomed while voice, authority, and long-term belonging remain conditional. And that experience stayed with me. So alongside my media work, I was also mentoring young offenders through creative filmmaking projects, mostly in inner city London sort of contexts. So these were not symbolic activities by any stretch of the imagination. Coming proudly from an inner city London background myself, it was about wanting to give back in some way. So young people learn to use professional equipment, which I taught them how to use. So we're talking sort of industry standard cameras, non-linear editing. And then through this usage, they were able to tell their own stories and produce short films, which were then later exhibited in local cinemas. The work was challenging, emotionally demanding, and structurally under-resourced, but deeply meaningful. And it showed me how education can open alternative pathways and futures when it's rooted in dignity, skill, and trust rather than deficit. I was in those spaces as someone who shared a similar history to the people that were experiencing filmmaking through the lens of, not feeling that their stories were told, feeling they were spoken for, feeling that they had something to say, but having that inner city London parallel really allowed us to connect. So this was my orientation towards education. So in my early 20s, I made a conscious decision to shift careers. And I did not leave media because of failure. I left because I recognized its limits as a space for ethical, sustained impact. I moved into teaching alongside my creative practice, gaining teaching qualifications while continuing to work. Education offered a language for justice, structure, and transformation, and a way to work with people over time rather than extract value and move on. Education, pedagogy, teaching and learning, research, storytelling, media making, whatever I've been involved in, it's always been rooted in wanting to make a change within my sphere of influence and wanting to approach that as the best version of myself in terms of ethics. And I know that that can sometimes come across as being quite a naive standpoint, but at this ripe old age that I am, it's continued to serve me well. Not without challenges, but it still served me well. So I spent over a decade teaching in further education across inner city and Greater London colleges, and I taught media, film, vocational routes, so A-level, BTECs, foundational degrees. And FE was by far one of the most challenging sectors in education that I've worked in. It was politically exposed, it was underfunded, and often expected to absorb social inequality without adequate support. But one big elephant in the room, which fairly recent press coverage revealed a few years back, it's also notoriously racist. So it was an extremely difficult space to navigate. Throughout this period, I was consistently graded outstanding based on the Ofsted scale. So as a result, something was recognized to extract. Through competitive selection, I became a faculty level mentor, and it was actually a really useful experience because it taught me how policy is enacted on bodies, not just paper. It was also during my time in further education that my longitudinal doctoral research took shape. So this was non-funded and purely through wanting to arrive at the answers to the research question. So I undertook an in-depth study of learners who had been labelled as GCSE failed, and I followed their educational trajectories over 10 years. Their trajectories, educational and work. And it was to see the lived impact of 14 to 19 policy that had emerged around the time that these learners had started their studies in FE. And that research is captured in my book, Imposed Identities and British Further Education, if anybody's interested in that type of work. So what became clear was that failure was not located in the learner. It was produced through systems, thresholds, and classifications that disproportionately affect working class and racialized students. FE became the site where I could see most clearly how belonging is manufactured and withheld, and how young people learn very early whether the institution sees a future for them or merely manages them. And that research now underpins everything I do. It taught me to read institutions, longitudinally, not episodically, and to understand identity, aspiration, and exclusion as processes rather than moments. So I started working quite significantly on teacher education as my FE career was coming to a tail end. This sort of manifested as mentoring on teacher education, as well as later teaching on a range of courses. So everything from PGCEs to CertEds and PETALs and DETALs and CELTAs and DELTAs. And I also mentored in-service and pre-service PGCE students. So this phase sharpened my questions, and I began to see how legitimacy is produced and how some educators are fast-tracked while others are stabilized but never progressed, and how race, gender, and class shape who is seen as an authority. And my particular concerns were around lack of representation in this field, particularly in placement schools and colleges and in senior leadership. So the move into higher education came through my role as PGCE pathway leader at Central. And when the course was later suspended due to government policy, I transitioned into specialized HE. I transitioned into a range of different skills, transferable skills-based work, which I'd ironically accumulated from my time in FE. And so over the course of that time, I completed my PhD and began really developing my research presence. But fundamentally, all of that tied to the time that I had spent in education and in media, in storytelling in particular. So now where things currently stand is that my research is interdisciplinary and longitudinal. It sits on the intersection of sociology, educational policy, media, and identity. And at its core, my work examines belonging, not as a feeling, but as a structure. I'm interested in how institutions produce inclusion rhetorically, while maintaining exclusion materially. My work centers race, gender, faith, disability, and class as intersecting forces rather than isolated variables that I also embody in my own lived experience. I ask who belongs in higher education and on what terms, how institutions manufacture legitimacy, why global majority and South Asian women are often relied upon for inclusion labor but denied security and progression, how identities are performed, negotiated, and sometimes strategically silenced in order to survive academic spaces. These are not abstract questions. These are institutional ones. So my research offers a framework for understanding belonging as a structure, as structural rather than emotional. It provides language for experiences that are often individualized or dismissed. It connects policy analysis to lived experience and shows how inclusion cannot be separated from governance, power, and resource allocation. It is designed to be usable for institutions, for educators, and for those navigating those systems. And higher education is at a crossroads. We see increasing diversity without structural repair. We see burnout, overextension, and quiet exits, particularly among global majority women. My research speaks to the cost of conditional belonging and the limits of performative inclusion. This is not about resilience, it's about responsibility. And my closing reflection is that I want to end where I began. My journey from media to education is not a departure story, it's a convergence. Storytelling, pedagogy, and justice have always been connected in my work. I offer this research not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to name what we experience, to refuse isolation, and to imagine institutions that do not require self-erasure at the price of belonging. If you are interested in the different composite parts of my work, you may be interested in starting off with the My Name Is project, particularly because we started off with a series of short documentaries which are available on YouTube, and I can forward those links on. And that includes my own story of how I went from Joe to Javeria, back to Javeria, I should say, as part of my self-decolonization process. And that's it. That's me, as in much of a nutshell as I could. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Javeria.
Oh.
Fantastic. At this stage, then, if anyone has any questions, what we'll do is we'll check the chat, but also feel free to put your hand up, unmute, and ask the questions directly to Javeria.